Hi YouTube, most of the sculpting that I normally do is of weird creatures from movies and that kind of thing. This is going to be a little bit different because since I was a kid I've collected loads of fossils and I've always wanted to have an Archaeopteryx fossil in my collection. Clearly I'm never going to own one because they're so rare, and I'm never going to find one either. So I thought I'll have a go at making a replica Archaeopteryx. So what I've done here is I've printed off in 4 parts this replica. This is also a replica Archaeopteryx fossil, but this is actual size and it's cast from the real thing. So what I'm going to do here is just stick this to the piece of corkboard, cut it all out, and then it'll be ready for me to start sculpting on top of. So this is what it looks like with the white edges of paper trimmed off, and I've glued it onto the corkboard. The corkboard is quite floppy, but that doesn't matter because I'm going to be adding a piece of solid plywood to the back of this. My next stage is going to be to take some tracing paper and just trace out these contour edges. Once I've done that, I'll print that onto some plywood and then I'll cut those out and stick them on, and that will be the start of the kind of 3-dimensional process. You can see I've stuck the original piece of corkboard onto a sheet of plywood. This makes the whole thing a lot more rigid and sturdy now. I used the same thin plywood for the contour shapes. I cut them out with a jigsaw and then just sanded them to give them nice rounded edges. This is the first piece that I cut. It'll go up in the top corner like this. And this is the second piece that will go all the way along the bottom like this. Here they are stuck in place. I'm using flooring PVA glue to stick them because it's so much stronger than normal PVA. Here you can see I've added an extra layer. This just doubles up the contouring and it will ultimately make it look a lot more realistic when I come to do the sculpting on top. A couple of the pieces I just left as single layer because on the original fossil they look to be a bit thinner. So there's this piece here and also this piece at the top. For all of the actual sculpting I'm going to be using MILLIPUT. If you haven't used MILLIPUT before, it's a 2-part putty. You mix the 2 parts together in equal amounts and it starts to set. It sets rock hard in about 4 hours. It's a really great product because you don't have to bake it in the oven or anything like that. It just sets at room temperature. The main reason that I choose to use MILLIPUT, apart from the fact that I don't have to cook it in the oven, is that once it is set, it is really rock hard. It's so tough and it's really hard wearing, and it just means that bits of it aren't going to kind of flake off or chip or anything like that. Once you've done your sculpt, it stays how you've done your sculpt. So a lot of these stone textures you can see here, I've actually made by just going in the garden, getting a whole load of limestone and sandstone, and then I've just pressed bits of stone into the surface and it's given me all the same sort of texture. You can see I've gone into a lot of the contours as well, and I've just done a bit of sculpting, and any little thin cracks and that sort of thing I've actually sculpted in place as well. Most of these I've looked at the replica fossil that I'm copying from and I've tried to copy all the same kind of cracks, and it seems to be working so far. I'm really pleased with it at this stage. Obviously all the hardest stuff is still to go because it's all of the bones of Archaeopteryx that are going to be the trickiest things to do. Just on a side note about replica fossils, I actually own a replica ichthyosaur fossil as well, and it's a whole ichthyosaur. So the reason I bought that particular one is because I've been to Lyme Regis so many times looking for bits of ichthyosaur, and I found quite a few vertebrae over the years, bits of bone and that kind of thing. But obviously I've never found a complete ichthyosaur, and I probably never will. So I decided to buy a replica which does really just look like the real thing. With this Archaeopteryx fossil, that's why I'm doing it. It's the same reason. I actually looked, and a replica Archaeopteryx fossil, they tend to go for about £300 or £400, and that's a little bit too much for me, so I thought I'll have a go at making one instead and see how close I can get to the replicas that you can buy on eBay and that kind of thing. Incidentally, these are the bits of stone that I've been pressing into the surface, so you can see they've got really nice texture to them, and these kind of curved stones like this are particularly good because you can just roll them over the surface, and on these really big flat areas make some really good textures. Obviously, as replica fossils go, this one's actually pretty tiny. It's 46 centimeters high by 37 centimeters wide. My ichthyosaur replica is a lot bigger than that. If this goes well, I may consider making something larger in the future. Maybe something like a T-Rex skull would be quite cool, because clearly I'm never going to be able to afford to buy a real one of those. So you can see I sculpted the skull and a lot of the larger bones, and then what I'm doing is making them all individually, letting them dry, and then sticking them on with the fluorine PVA glue. I can really recommend having a printout of another replica fossil underneath it, because it means that you can really get your sizing quite accurate. So at first glance it probably doesn't look like I've done much since you saw it last, but I've been working on all the little thin foot bones and claws. Those little fiddly bits take quite a long time to do, but also the spinal column. I've done all of these little vertebrae individually and worked my way along the whole length right down to the very kind of tip of his tail. And I think that's looking pretty cool. But now what I've got to do is the feather effect, and I think that's going to be quite tricky. My kind of idea of doing it is, again, to take some tracing paper and just draw out the actual lines of where all the kind of feather effects are. And you can see I've drawn the contour lines as well around the edge so that I can line it up. Then what I'll do is I'll put some MILLIPUT on as a very thin layer into that whole area. Then I can press through the tracing paper to give me all of my lines back again. Like this. So you can see both of the wings and the tail I've done in exactly the same way, with the tracing paper and then pushing through all of the lines to show where the feathers are. So Archaeopteryx, if you're not aware already, was a reptile, but it also had feathers. So it's basically like a sort of a missing link fossil between reptiles and birds. So it's a really, really important fossil. It had a very typical reptilian scaly skin, and it also had teeth like a reptile as well. I didn't want any of the corkboard or the plywood to show in the end, so what I've done is I've gone around all of the edges as well, just with, again, a thin layer of MILLIPUT that I've pressed stones into to give it this really nice texture. This is all going to look really amazing when it's all painted up, but even at this stage where it's just the colour of the MILLIPUT, it's starting to give all the right sorts of textures that I'm really kind of hoping to achieve. Okay, this was the first stage of the painting. So I'm using System 3 acrylic paints, and what I did was I started with a mix of yellow ochre and white, just to give me this very creamy colour. This is just the palest kind of base colour, and I put it on not too thick because I didn't want it to go into all of the little tiny holes and get rid of all of my lovely textures. So it's quite watered down, but you can see it's really just a base colour, and then I'll build up lots of other colour on top of this. I remember being really pleased with how it was looking at this stage, and I knew that any extra colour washes would just make it look even better. So here I made a really watery wash of yellow ochre, and I just washed it literally over the whole thing. And because it was a really wet wash, it just sunk down into all of the little cracks and all of the little dips. And it kind of sits just in those places, and it leaves all of the original cream colour just on the top. I will be doing some dry brushing as well back into this with an even lighter colour, but at the moment this is really starting to make everything kind of pop out and look a bit more kind of three-dimensional. After I'd added this really wet wash, I remember using a hairdryer to get it dried as quickly as possible, because I was really looking forward to starting to paint the bones a really dark colour. It's because I knew the Archaeopteryx skeleton would really stand out if it was darker. Like this. So this is how it turned out. I've ended up painting all of the bones in this, it's like a really dark sort of maroon colour, made with just green and red mixed together. More red than green, obviously. And then when I first painted it on, it looked a little bit too kind of fake and stark, so I've dry brushed a lot of the original kind of cream colour onto it as well, and that's kind of tied in more with the background colour. Also, when I looked at the photographs of the replica, it had some kind of yellowish tinges to the bones as well, so I've just watered down some cadmium yellow and just as a wash, just put little bits onto the bones as well. And I think that again helps it tie in with the background colour so it doesn't stand out too much, but just the right sort of amount. On the actual stonework, I've dry brushed some much lighter cream colour, mainly into the wing areas actually, but also some of the edges on the contours as well. That's made a big difference. Then when I looked at the whole thing, it looked cool, but it had something missing, and what it was little grey hints. So I made a grey colour just with black and white mixed together as a very watery wash again, and I've just put that into some of these sort of shadow areas, and it really helps the stone look more like kind of real limestone. I don't know if this video is really doing it much justice, but in real life it looks pretty much like stone and I'm really chuffed with the result. Obviously here I'm zooming right in on it, and you know, maybe you're looking at things thinking it looks a little bit fake, but actually in real life it's not as zoomed in as we're seeing it here, so it looks much more realistic. So this whole sculpt I've made over 3 days, so it didn't take too long overall, and it's obviously saved me £300 or £400. I've probably used about, I don't know, £20 worth of MILLIPUT, something like that, but that's it. The rest was just, you know, bits of wood that I had knocking about in the shed and a bit of corkboard, so pretty cheap really for what would have been a really expensive replica if I'd have bought it. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's inspired some of you to go out and do a bit of sculpting of your own. I'd like to thank MILLIPUT for sponsoring this channel. Let me know in the comments if you prefer this kind of sculpting to the usual creatures and things that I make from movies. Check out my other videos if you want to see any of those. Hit subscribe if you want to see anything that I post up in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.